mit mir sollte hier auch noch Andrea Scrima auftauchen. Da ist schon mal die E-Mail-Adresse, falls jemand Fanpost verschicken möchte. Dann könnt ihr das jetzt hier abschreiben und dann direkt an Andrea Scrima die Fanpost schicken. Aber nur gute Sachen. Deine E-Mail-Adresse stand da. Hallo, hörst du mich?
Ja, ich höre dich. Hallo, hörst du mich?
Super. Und,
Okay.
ja, ich höre dich auch sehr gut. Schön, dass du dich da auch so, ich weiß nicht, das war die richtige Einstellung. Ja, bist du nervös? Erste Mal Online-Lesung?
Nein, ich bin einfach nur froh, dass ich reingekommen bin.
Dass es technisch geklappt hat. So.
Ja, genau. Ja.
Ja. Und was liest du? Oder was wirst du lesen heute?
Ich lese ein Essay, das heißt auf Englisch Corona Report. Das sind Eindrücke aus Italien teilweise. Ich war 5 Wochen da und bin gerade erst Ende Februar zurückgekommen. Gerade auf der Kippe, also ein paar Tage vor den ersten Lockdowns sozusagen. Und es ist tatsächlich zusammengestellt aus Auszügen aus einem neuen Buch zu einem Essay gemacht.
An dem du am Arbeiten bist noch, das Buch, oder das ist schon veröffentlicht?
Nee, das ist ich bin gerade dabei, daran zu arbeiten.
Okay.
Und so
schön. Ja, sind wir gespannt. Ich überlasse dir auch gleich die Bühne, sage wie immer noch kurz, dass man Fragen gerne in den Chat posten kann, da einfach reinschreiben, rechts vom Streambild, da kann man irgendwie so Chat ausklappen und dann sieht man da auch die, zum Beispiel die Vita von Andrea, aber auch genau das ganze Gespräch, und da kann man gerne Fragen reinposten, und am Ende deiner Lesung in Englisch, ne? Du liest in Englisch. Ja, das war im Titel eigentlich schon veranlagt mit Corona Report. Und genau, Katrin wird sich dann am Schluss zuschalten und mit den Fragen oder was auch immer beim Chat so lief. Und es gibt einen PayPal-Link, mit dem so wie an allen Lesungen quasi der Obolus entrichtet werden kann und uns als Viral ermöglichen wird, dass wir allen Autorinnen ein Honorar zahlen können. Ein kleines Honorar, aber immerhin. Und so wünsche ich dir jetzt eine gute Lesung und Ihnen eine gute Lesung ebenfalls und verabschiede mich aus diesem Anruf und genau, und überlasse das mal ganz dir.
Ja, alles klar. Okay. Ich schalte hier auf Word. Also, Corona Report. The invisible enemy hit Italy just as I was preparing to leave Florence. Containment measures had begun a week prior to my departure. At first, the red zones of Codogno and other municipalities in Lodi were subject to quarantine. Then the whole of Lombardy, together with provinces in Emilia-Romagna, Veneto, Piedmont, and Marche. And then on March 9th, the entire country was placed under lockdown. I thought of my room in the Oltrarno, empty. I tried to imagine Piazza Santo Spirito empty, the library at the Piazza Torquato Tasso filled with students studying for their final exams only the week before, closed. The enormous Palazzo Pitti closed. Tried to imagine the Porta Romana crossing empty, the little cafe on the corner empty, the Via dei Serragli empty. The prospect of restricting the movement of 16 million people and then 60 million people seemed surreal. How had reality transformed into science fiction so quickly? Until the understanding sank in that all of Europe would quite likely soon be under quarantine. The weeks I'd spent there before the threat of the pandemic's destructive power became manifested in exponential infection curves and a health system hopelessly overwhelmed seemed as though they belonged to a distant past. The number of dead in Italy had been rising daily ever since. We read reports of wartime triage regulations, of doctors and nurses on the brink of mental and emotional collapse. Reports of hundreds of coffins stacked up at gates of cemeteries and convoys of army vehicles carting them away. Families were losing their loved ones without a chance to say goodbye. Funerals were strictly prohibited. In Germany, we were still allowed to go outside if we kept at a distance to one another, but everyone knew that further restrictions were imminent. One evening, at a prearranged time, we stood at our windows and balconies and applauded the empty streets, a gesture meant to express gratitude to the medical profession. But as we began banging pots and cheering and the din reached a feverish pitch, it seemed as though we were engaged in an atavistic ritual, trying to make enough noise to shoo the invisible hobgoblin away. Although hospitals were still waiting for the deluge to arrive, newspapers already reported shortages of protective gear, masks, disinfectant, ventilators, and staff. Following a 2-week period of self-imposed isolation, during which I read far too many articles on pandemics, the R0 contagion factor and virus mutation, I left the apartment to go to the grocery store, and as my hand gripped the banister and I made my way cautiously down the 4 flights of stairs, absurdly, I tripped in the apartment during my quarantine and sprained my ankle. I realized that I was potentially coming into contact with the pathogen, left behind by the hand of someone entering or leaving the building. No one knew for sure how long the virus could survive on a given surface. The front section of our building counts 10 apartments and at least 30 people going up and down the stairs each day, not including postal deliveries. Outside, the hand that touched the banister was the hand I used to zip up my jacket against the cold. This same hand took the items from the store shelf and placed them in the basket, fished the ATM card out of my wallet and paid, and stowed the groceries in my backpack. Leaving the store, I squirted some homemade hand sanitizer onto my hands and rubbed them together, but if I'd picked up the virus, it was on my jacket now, or on the items I'd purchased, or on the handle of the basket I'd returned to the stack at the store's entrance, waiting for the next customer. We weren't used to the idea of living in times of disaster. We'd been protected for so long that, although comparatively brief in historical terms, the period of post-war peace and prosperity we'd come of age in seemed normal. Other people outside the still stable countries we lived in, had been going through hell for so long that we'd gotten used to the idea that even if we were living from paycheck to paycheck, even if we were working class, we were somehow magically exempt from the world's worst calamities. We watched them on television or on laptops, catching up on the news as we ate our lunch at our desks and closing browser windows when we were finished. Famine, disease, war, plague, these happened to underdeveloped nations or to dictatorships and not to us. As the pandemic spread throughout Europe and the rest of the world, those of us who could worked at home and read the news avidly. We stocked up on rice, beans, lentils, and oil, but then, wholly unaccustomed to disaster, for the first time we wondered how we'd cook meals if there were suddenly no water to be had or no gas for the stove. Should we have been taking our cues from the survivalist movement, stockpiling canned goods, fuel, water, flashlights and batteries, shortwave radio? Should we have been digging out bunkers? We were only just getting used to the idea of doing without cinema, museums, theater performances, readings, and already we were facing the prospect of mass death and worldwide economic collapse. Newspaper articles instructed us on how we should be reaching out to the vulnerable, people with anxiety disorder, people who are alone and at risk, as though we weren't already checking in with friends regularly. We settled in for the long haul, began disinfecting the food packages we brought into the apartment, downloaded patterns for homemade face masks, and wondered if the sectors of the economy that had sustained our freelance existence would survive the impending recession. Our first impulse when confronted with the online images of refugees trapped in the dangerously overcrowded Moria internment camp on the Greek island of Lesbos was to turn away. We'd already cried over the thousands of dead in Italy, thousands more in France and Spain, and we were waiting in dread for the peak of the curve to arrive. And for the moment, our empathy was limited to wondering anxiously who among us would catch the virus and succumb. Dark thoughts haunted us. It felt like an overdue punishment, as though we in the rich countries secretly knew that our wealth and prosperity had been stolen, that we'd been living at the expense of others and had been waiting all along for a calamity to come and take it all away. 3 days before Italy's first recorded death from COVID-19, the UEFA Champions League soccer match between Bergamo and Valencia, which Bergamo's mayor Giorgio Gori would later identify as the decisive biological bomb, took place on February 19th at the San Siro Stadium in Milan. 44,000 fans crowded together to watch a game that had been heavily promoted as the largest in Atalanta's history, holding up signs that read, "Insieme da sempre, insieme per sempre," always together, together forever, and cheering wildly while thousands more gathered with friends and family to watch the game on TV. Although the first domestic cases had already been confirmed, the coronavirus was still seen as a Chinese epidemic. Unaware of the danger, a third of Bergamo's population hopped in their cars and chartered buses, clogging the roads and causing 3-hour traffic jams on a stretch of highway that normally took 40 minutes. When Atalanta won, fans were delirious. Jubilant, they flooded the streets and squares of Milan and crowded into the bars and restaurants of their hometowns to celebrate, hugging and singing and drinking well into the night, and the next morning and turning virtually all of Lombardy into an epicenter of the pandemic, as 2,500 disappointed Spanish fans who traveled to Milan for the game flew home, carrying the virus with them. In the press, Atalanta's managing director defended soccer's importance to the country's morale. "Today's results prove us right," he said, following Bergamo's 4-1 victory, "and our city deserves it. Our boys will go down in history for society and for all of Italy." By mid-March, when this turned out to be true, although not for the reasons the team's manager had envisaged, I realized just how close I'd come to contagion. The day a third of Bergamo's population flocked to the San Siro Stadium was the day I left Florence to travel to Greci, the village my grandfather Luigi emigrated from nearly 120 years ago, and that he never returned to, that his mother, Maria Luisa, never returned to, that none of his 9 Bronx-born children, including my father, had ever seen. None of their children had ever seen. Had I boarded the Frecce Argento in Bologna the following morning, the train heading south from Milan, I wouldn't have sat next to Fabio during the 4.5-hour trip, but quite possibly a hungover soccer fan who'd spent the night reveling and was now headed home, snoring in his seat. In which case, it's likely that I would have caught the virus and passed it on to Rita and Pino, my hosts, would have passed it on to their son Luigi, who drives the town's ambulance, passed it on to Aulo and the rest of the staff at the Comune, from where it would have spread to Greci's overwhelmingly elderly population. 3 weeks later, just as Bergamo counted the highest number of COVID-19 deaths in the country, a third of the Spanish soccer team tested positive for the virus, and the number of dead in Valencia had reached more than 3,000. Bayern München was still planning to play Union Berlin until the Bundesliga, having come under heavy criticism, finally called off the match. In the case of the Atalanta game, signs of the impending pandemic had appeared well ahead of the event. On the Regionale, it took from Florence to catch the Frecce Argento in Bologna in the early morning of February 19th. Trenitalia broadcast a solemn announcement that it was taking the danger seriously and was implementing all necessary precautions. But when I got up to use the toilet, I was puzzled to find the soap dispenser empty. The first cases had already emerged, but the coronavirus was still seen as something